So many people think grief is just an emotion, and it's the sadness and it's the heaviness and it's all sort of the negative feelings that they associate with grief. And grief is really an experience on such a broad spectrum of emotion. So it affects us emotionally, spiritually, mentally, physically, psychically. And within that spectrum, there is room for so many emotions. And joy is one of them. Wonder is one of them. All these things that we may not associate with this negative, so-called negative experience are available to us in grief.
Hello, and welcome to the Conspiracy of Goodness podcast, where you'll hear conversations that generate one aha moment after another for you. There is an enormous wave of goodness and progress well underway in the world that almost no one knows enough about yet. It is so well hidden by all the negative noise in our media that I'm calling this wave of goodness a conspiracy of goodness. Yes, it is still an amazing world out there. And on this podcast, we're going to introduce you to the people making it that way. Hello, I'm Dr. Linda Ulrich, founder of the Goodness Exchange. That's the website that's the mothership to this podcast. There you can get instant access to good news about insight and inspiration that just is not being celebrated enough in the mainstream media. The Goodness Exchange can put a spring in your step, and so will our guests today. So I am here to introduce you to an amazing person who will take us on a little journey that we could not have gone on without her. Most of us have had some form of grief in our lives. We've lost someone that we love very much, and we are told by society that we have to get over it or that we have to move on from it. And she has an entirely different take on grief. Naila is a writer, a grief coach, a death midwife, and an ordained interfaith minister. Naila Francis is bringing a kind of fresh perspective to one of the two experiences in life that every one of us share, birth and death. I mean, that's it. And somehow we've made it this far in humanity to where we celebrate birth, but we don't quite know what to do with death. She says that we can move forward with it, not from it. And I think that's just a lovely place for us to start our conversation today. Just so you know, Naila helps people in all kinds of sacred moments in life, beyond just death. So we're going to talk about marriage and transitional parts of life. We're going to talk about how if you've got unresolved grief, and just 2% of unresolved grief can affect all kinds of parts of our lives. I had no idea that we could carry it and look at it in a different way, so our lives aren't defined by these losses and the pain of loss. So welcome, Naila Francis, to the Conspiracy of Goodness podcast.
Thank you so much, Dr. Linda. It's an honor and a joy to be here. I know people often think when I say it's a joy to talk about grief, what is she talking about? But it is such a joy to be here with you today.
Well, maybe that's a great place to start because, one of the things I picked up right off my work and homework on your work was that you teach people how to access grief from a place of joy. I don't know. I've just lost 4 immediate family members in the last year. And man, when I read accessing grief from a place of joy, that was about as far from my lived experience and what I think is possible as it could be. But then after learning all about your work, I could see it. So talk to us, start there. How about that?
Yeah, sure. I think with grief and joy, first of all, I just want to say so many people think grief is just an emotion, and it's the sadness and it's the heaviness and it's all sort of the negative feelings that they associate with grief. And grief is really an experience on such a broad spectrum of emotion. So it affects us emotionally, spiritually, mentally, physically, psychically. And within that spectrum, there is room for so many emotions, and joy is one of them. Wonder is one of them. All these things that we may not associate with this negative, so-called negative experience are available to us in grief. So one of the invitations I like to offer people is really to tune into what feels good in your body. And that sort of softens and relaxes you so that you can allow the grief to surface. So it might be that you're dancing because dancing brings you such great joy. You've had this big loss, something, terrible has happened in your life. You hadn't had a chance to process or experience your grief, but the act of dancing can shift and open up something inside you. It's almost like, I don't know, you're melting a little bit, just softening and deepening into your grief so that the grief can come forward for you to acknowledge and face it.
So is it about, maybe I'm wrong, but is it about what we give our attention to during this process? Like what we consciously choose to give our attention to rather than sort of just following our emotions over a cliff?
That's definitely a very big part of it. I mean, I'm not definitely advocating focusing on joy, joy, joy. That's not going to really give you like the full experience of grieving. But I do think there is so much fear around feeling grief, so much stigma around it, this sense that, oh my God, you just said like fall off a cliff, this sense that, oh my gosh, if I just allow myself to acknowledge this, it's going to consume me. I'm going to be on the floor. I'm not going to be able to function. And it's really like incremental attention. Like grieving does not have to be like, oh my gosh, this day is going to I'm just going to give this day over to grief. I'm going to be like, yes, you may be grieving for months, for years, for however long, but it's not like that's the daily story of your life. So making room, like incremental bits of room to just sit with your grief and allow it to sort of move through you can definitely help with the overwhelming nature of it.
So talk to me a bit about what that means to sit with grief and let it move through you. I know a little bit more about that.
So when I think of sitting with grief, one of the simplest things for me is checking in with your heart. We live in such a culture where like we're always sort of rushing to the moment in front of us or like ruminating on the past. And when it comes to grief, I understand the tendency to ruminate on the past, especially if you've lost a loved one to death. You're maybe rethinking all the things that you could have done, the regrets for what you didn't say or wish you had done better. You're just missing them and like longing for those moments. But sometimes that also leads to this conscious or unconscious desire to change the past, but your person is gone and there's nothing you can do to bring them back. And that fixation on the past is keeping you from being like right here where your grief is, or you're wondering about like, what in the world could my future possibly look like without this person? Again, keeping you from being right here. And your grief is in the present moment. And so part of sitting with grief is allowing yourself to be in the present moment with all these things that you're feeling. And it does require sometimes solitude to just, pause from all the ways that we distract ourselves and give our attention to other things to not feel what we're feeling, to allow solitude so that we can really tune into like, oh, what's really here for me? What's my heart saying to me in this moment? What am I really feeling in my body? Like, here's this ache, because grief manifests in our body in so many ways and we might not know it. Like all of a sudden I have this backache or this shoulder pain or these things that are going on that I never had before. But if you're not really taking time to feel your grief, it shows up in these other ways. And I think go ahead.
No, I mean, I'm really thinking about the way my patients in my practice, how their lives unfold after a great loss. And a lot of those elements do manifest themselves. Other physical ailments and so forth. I think you're right. Like, and not that those things will suddenly disappear once we get our arms around grief, but this being in the present with a mindset that isn't forward thinking or backward longing That is probably a really good little opportunity to just really pay attention to what you're giving your attention to.
Yes. Yeah. And it's so sort of countercultural to how we live, right? Because it's very fast-paced culture, very performative, like production oriented. And I think of grief as such a, even though, like you said, we all experience birth and death, but we just don't celebrate this part of life or really make space for it. We're all grieving. And I think, or we're all going to grieve at some point in our lives. And grief requires like slowing down, sort of letting go of things, being gentle, offering ourselves compassion, all these things that we're not really encouraged in this culture. It's all about like extracting and accumulation and moving fast and all of those things that don't really like encourage like, oh, I'm grieving. How can I tend to my heart right now?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
You know what? Way back when, 25 years ago, I had a 1 pound baby. Yes, it was such an amazing experience. She lived. And of course, that's why I can say it was such an amazing experience. But she was called a micro preemie. And on day 2, one of the doctors who came to visit her, and there was no chance, it was 1,000,000 to 1 that she would live, much less grow up without disabilities. And he said, he gave me this great bit of freedom. He says, it's okay to get off the merry-go-round. It's okay. Just everybody around you who cares about you is going to understand if you don't return their calls, if you don't, if you aren't engaging in big, long conversations about how this happened and all the things. Just step off. Just don't even look at life the same way for a time. And everyone understands. Yeah. Just allow yourself this. And I think that's what he was trying to say, was to, instead of just staying on the merry-go-round, to allow, how does that strike you? I know one thing you say is there shouldn't be like an attempt to fix or solve or distract. We cannot think our way out of grief.
Yeah.
Talk to us about that.
I think the thinking gets us stuck because grief wants to be felt. It's in the body. Our body holds our joys and our sorrows, all of our emotions. The body is really the container for that. So if you're trying to think your way out of your grief, you're not really sort of metabolizing it, if you will. Like, we eat food and it goes to different parts of our body, does different things. Like grief wants the same sort of metabolization. And if you're thinking, you could be getting yourself stuck. Now, there is an aspect of, depending on who you are, it might be really helpful and sort of comforting to you to read a lot about grief, to look for like the studies and the theories and the models to help make sense of it and like sort of give you some sense of organization or control. But ultimately, that's still not helping you get into your grief. And the thoughts that we have about guilt, regret, all of those sort of thinking ways that keep us like ruminating, like I said, those also can keep us stuck and not able to access our grief. And I also think we're so hard on ourselves. So many of the grievers that I encounter really beat themselves up for not being over it, for not doing it right, as if you can do grief wrong or right, for, the fact that they like don't feel like getting out of bed one day, all the things that, are just such a normal experience of grief. They really give themselves a hard time. And self-compassion is so key to moving with grief, kind of giving ourselves that grace. I love that your doctor encouraged you to, make that time for yourself, because that feels like, so as you were talking about it, it felt so gentle and nourishing to me. And that's really what we need to give ourselves our own kind and gentle attention, because there's also part of like the thinking, like, oh, I should be doing this better, or it's something that can be fixed, or something I can get to the other side, that suggests there's something wrong with us And the minute you start from the vantage point of there's something wrong with me, that's going to lead to like, I have to change this. I have to fix this. I have to do something differently. And it's like, no, this is life. This is part of life. We're all going to have to encounter this in some way. Yeah.
Yeah. And even I kind of like the way you and I had a pre-call, and I kind of like the way we looked at grief as not just like the law of death. You know, you can grieve the life you thought you were headed to, and then the pandemic hit and your life was turned upside. You can grieve things that didn't happen the way you thought, right? Like,
yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I think so many of us have those kind of griefs. They're called non-finite losses. Those sort of like you expected things to be one way and then they ended up not being that way. But there's also this idea that grief only pertains to death. And there is so much that we could be grieving. I think just being a human being is to really be face to face with grief on a regular basis. Since we don't talk about it, we just don't even know that maybe that feeling that we're feeling is grief.
Yes.
Yeah.
So we're going to take a quick break, and I want to turn folks on to something new that we're doing at the Goodness Exchange to help. I guess it's in a way related to this topic, to help people with a sense of well-being in their working lives. So we'll take a break, and when we come back, we will talk more with Naila Francis. Hi, Dr. Linda here. Many of you know that the mothership website of this podcast is called the Goodness Exchange. And there you can find articles, a video library, podcasts, and content collections that point to what's right with the world. You can visit every day and you'll find the antidote to all the negative noise out there in the world. Okay, that solves the problem in our personal lives. We can choose what to give our attention to every morning and end our day with something positive. But what about our work environments? We need to feel supported and come alive in those cultures. But that's becoming harder and harder when most of us go to virtual work. And many of us who are working with others still never have shared positive experiences with our colleagues. By definition, culture comes from shared experience. So employees find it harder and harder every day to create an environment that attracts and retains other great people. Well, enter the Goodness Exchange and our extraordinary content, which celebrates an enormous wave of goodness and progress well underway in the world that almost no one knows enough about yet. My team and I at the Goodness Exchange are making certain that employees of optimistic, values-driven companies have instant access to the positive news out there today, because science is telling us that it's time to start celebrating what's right with the world. And here's the thing, there are so many positive stories out there about astounding solutions to some of our world's biggest problems, about wonders and leaps in human potential. But most are going completely uncelebrated. Your culture can change that and can be changed by a new focus on goodness and progress. In fact, with all that negative noise out there, your work culture can be infused by a sense of flourishing. People can be sharing ideas and swapping stories of wonderful, ingenious solutions around the water cooler again. With instant access to good news, employees can stay on their feet and take turns being the one who makes opportunity out of setback. People who use the Goodness Exchange every day have a spring in their step. They radiate joy and confidence and creativity because they know a far more complete picture of what's going on in the world. If you'd like to chat about infusing the culture where you work with a tone of celebration, of goodness, and innovation and progress, let's hop on a Zoom. You can introduce us to your HR director or your chief of culture. You know, if used consistently, our content can give companies a way to turn something aspirational, like positivity, into a concrete way of being. Thanks. Talk to us at the Goodness Exchange about change and flourishing where you work. Okay, we're back with Naila Francis. She is I don't know, would you call yourself a grief coach, Naila?
I do, but I don't really like the term coach. Obviously, it's what I'm certified in, but I really kind of think of myself as a grief guide, a grief tender. Coaching to me has such a sort of performative aspect to it. Like, I'm going to get you through this and it's going to transform your life. And it's like, I really want people to just have space to be with their grief. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. So you heard me mention in your introduction that just 2% of unresolved grief can affect all kinds of areas of our lives. Like, do you have any stories? Do you have any ways that we can relate to that?
Yes. If you say that you lost somebody suddenly, traumatically to violence, and before that, you believed that the world was a benevolent place. You believed in the goodness of life, of the universe. And then that happened. Your entire sense of safety, security, what you can trust in, gone. You could start living your life from a very fearful and anxious place, always expecting something to go wrong, never opening yourself to really engage and be present in relationships because, oh my gosh, that person could just be gone in an instant. And it just could really sort of constrict your potential for living your own life because you're carrying that inside you and it's completely rearranged your whole world.
And I imagine you just made me kind of think about the fact that, the more I talk to kind people in the world, and I saw this in my professional life as well, that I'm beginning to think about 80% of us have some sort of childhood tragedy, something we do or do not talk about, something that maybe no one knows but us. And I think there's you can be stuck with a sense of grief about that is related to that childhood tragedy that does manifest in all kinds of ways that you trust or don't trust the world all around you. Can we carry grief from childhood that just is super unresolved?
Definitely, because so many of us as kids aren't given the language, first of all, to say, I'm grieving. I mean, we might feel sad, we might feel anger, we might feel all these things, but we don't really have any sort of language to say, oh, this is grief. This has been a really painful and traumatic, whatever it is, experience for me. And we don't often have models of grief. I don't know about you, but I grew up in a culture where grief wasn't overtly expressed or talked about. It was something not to think about or cheer up or, try not to worry about it. We're sort of dismissed and denied our own experience of grief from a very young age. So of course, those things are going to live inside us and we're going to carry them forward with us. And yeah, they can show up in very sneaky ways later on in life.
Yes. Okay. All right. So if we're here, we're very close to another topic that we should probably veer into sooner in the interview than I thought. But then there's this way that we judge how other people are grieving. So talk to us about that, because how many of us haven't been the second person from the stove? When my mom and my dad died, I watched my mom when he got the cancer diagnosis. She pretty much buried him that day and he lived another 7 years. But she already was grieving her future without him before.
Yeah. Oh.
And it was super easy for my family and I to judge my mom's grief process. And then after, when he did die, she didn't live life as fully as I said I would have. I mean, talk to us about judging other people's way of grieving.
And it's so funny because everybody grieves differently. It is such a unique experience. And yet we have this idea of what grief should look like. And I think the tendency to judge sometimes comes from our own discomfort with grief. Well, I would do this totally differently. That's not how I would do this grief experience. And so we expect that the other person should be doing it the way that we did. And this whole also idea of well, they're grieving wrong. What does that even mean? if they're taking too long, if it's been years or whatever it is, if they're still maybe sitting in the bedroom, wrapping themselves in that shirt, if they keep bringing up the same story over and over again. There's so many ways that we think people are grieving wrong. And it's really about shifting our attention from ourselves to the person who's actually grieving and making space for them and what their needs might be and how they need to be supported in their own grief journey.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So how about some practical tips? Because most of us have either been through this or we're taking care of elderly parents who are moving on down the line of life. Like, how about some practical tips? What have you seen or done lately that worked out well that you counseled someone about, or give us some practical tips?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of supporting other grievers, because that's something people often want to know about because, now there's starting to be more awareness of this wasn't helpful. The cliches are a big thing. Oh, he's in a better place. They wouldn't want you to be sad. At least you still have this child living. Like all those things that people say, just, I'm sorry, or I'm here. Or this must be so, so hard for you. People want to be affirmed in their feelings, and all these things we sort of rush to say make them feel like their experience isn't valid. It kind of takes them away from what they're really feeling. Don't say, how can I help?
So don't say any of those cliches.
Don't say any of those cliches. They're not helpful. And honestly, if you don't know what to say, I don't know what to say. Like that's honest and truthful and still meets the moment with kindness and not with judgment. I mean, that's so much more helpful than, hold on to all the good memories, cherish the times you had. What if they can't even find a good memory because their brain is grief brain is a real thing, or, their relationship was complicated. People also rush to say so many things, not knowing the full nature of a relationship. And that could be so harmful to the person. If you're saying, hang on to the good memories. And it's like, okay, we had a really challenging relationship and I can't remember the last good time we shared together. Yeah.
That is so true. One of the tips that you and I talked about in our pre-call was stepping out into nature. Now that might mean, if you're a city dweller, that might mean, 10 square meters of grass in a park. If you're somebody like me who lives in Vermont, it's all around you. But tell us about how you relate stepping out into nature to pausing and being present with grief.
I mean, I think we all know there have been so many studies about the therapeutic and healing benefits of nature. So stepping out into nature, I think, is one way to sort of regulate the nervous system and calm us down. And also, it's almost like taking a deep breath, like, oh, this is soothing to my senses right now. But I also think it's challenging. I'm not saying that your grief is just going to disappear. It's all of a sudden like, oh, I'm not grieving anymore. But when you're mindfully being in nature, like you're taking in like, oh, the gorgeousness of this flower right here, or the leaves of this tree, or, it's so magnificent to just sit by this water and, listen to it as it flows over the rocks, whatever it is, it's much harder to be focused on your grief when you're engaging in that wonder or marvel or beauty. Like you're giving your attention to something that's sort of lifting you out of your sorrow without you even really making much effort to do so. And so I think that's one of the great gifts of nature, is the way that it can draw us out of our sort of preoccupation with our own sadness without us really needing to put much effort toward that. I also feel like there's so much we can learn from nature in terms of like how it's speaking to us. Like we go out into nature and we think like, oh yeah, I'm just enjoying nature, but nature isn't inanimate. Like nature has a soul sort of all of its own. So maybe you're walking through the woods in the wintertime and you're looking at all the bare trees. Like, isn't that amazing? Like, but maybe the trees also have a message for you about what it's like to let go of their leaves and that trust that's, something else is going to come in place of that. And yes, it may not bring your loved one back if you're grieving a death, but the same way that everything buds again and, is renewed in spring, like this can be your season of loss, your fallow season. This can be like your empty period. But what can come to fill that? Where can you find renewal in your life? I just think there's so many ways that we can engage in nature that can really support our experience of grieving.
That's a great tip right there too. Talk to us about this attachment that we have to things. I mean, we mentioned that grieving can be the loss of anything, right?
Right.
We have this attachment to things that is unbelievable, and we can grieve the loss of your father's watch after his death, the loss of things. So talk to us about that.
Yes. I get it. I totally get that people want to hold on to these things as sort of symbols of connection, or maybe they think it's like an anchor to like holding on to my person. And yet sometimes holding on to things is also a way of being stuck. It's also a way of blocking like whatever wants to come through, to like whatever wants to live through us next, whatever our next life chapter is supposed to be. And I'm not talking about like rushing through grief or trying to get to the other side, but there's something about being open to grief and working with our grief, however we want to do that, that allows insight into how we want to live next, what really matters to us, what are the ways that we might live our lives differently than before. And I think holding on to things, just like kind of trying to think our way through grief, can keep us planted and stuck in our grief. And I also think sometimes like, okay, maybe keep the watch, but do you have to keep everything else? Maybe keep the one thing that has some really personal meaning and connection to you. But, don't sort of make a shrine of the bedroom or like whatever it is that you're doing. I also think people think holding on to things is holding on to their person. And that's not, that's not the way that grieving works often. It is because we're willing to feel our grief. We actually develop a different, but really deep and beautiful kind of relationship with the person who's gone, because to feel the grief is to really honor the immensity of love that we had for them. So we're like inviting them into our lives in a whole different way versus holding on to them thinking like, oh, well, if I hold on to all this stuff, like mom will always be with me. You're fixated on the stuff. You're not fixated or focusing, I should say, on the relationship and like what it meant to you and the beauty of it.
Now tell me, because this is getting very close to another topic that has a lot to do with grief, is, I 3 of the 4 people that I lost inside of 6 months were Catholic, and they were all, my husband comes from a giant Catholic family, big, in a small Midwestern farm town. And they had the most extraordinary habit of, after the funeral, the Knights of Columbus, the KFC hall, has almost like the way you think about a wedding reception after the wedding. Yeah. They have this great huge party where all the women in the KFCs bring their home dishes. There must have been 130 different ways to do macaroni and cheese and all the salad, broccoli salad, and wonderful. And I tell you what, it really made those 3 funerals, to have that at the end with all the people who cared and all the story swapping. And it really made those 3 ceremonies feel like a celebration. And I think, don't we open up for that, or open ourselves up for the celebratory part that you're talking about, treating death as sacred as it is, and allowing them it to be truly a celebration of our life.
Yeah.
When we have that planned in advance, we know that that's what's going to happen. I mean, talk to us about these rituals that you've seen that are cool. Besides that one, that's unique to the Catholic Church in our little hometown. But
Yeah.
others that are very helpful.
Yeah, I think it does open us up to that. And also, not a lot of people want a big celebration. So there's also that too, like honoring the very, very different ways that people want to die. And one of the beautiful things that I've seen that I personally love is actually people who have their celebration of life before they're dead. I mean, because so often, right, funeral, the memorial service, it's for the grievers. It's our chance to say goodbye, to share the stories, and you hear so often about how people say all of these glowing, wonderful things that they never said to the person while they were alive. So I love the chance to gather people and create a space where it's like, oh, here's all the love we have for you. Here's all the affirmation. Here's what we're going to miss. This is the moment that made me laugh. This is like the memory I'll never forget. And like, oh, like I would imagine that ushers people through the transition. Yes, there's still going to be a lot of grief and hardship, but with such a sense of like love and tenderness and like, oh, I really did the best I could for my loved one in that moment. Yeah.
I want to share something also that I wonder if you've come across two things actually that have been a good part of our life and our practice. My husband and I are both dentists. And when we know that a patient is still very, very conscious about the world around them, but that they're heading towards their final days, I'll sit down, take a really long look at my experiences with this person, and I'll write them a letter to tell them about all the things that I'm going to remember about them and how they changed my life. And how it could be, that they were just such a great barbecue expert. And every time they came in, I got a new recipe, and they always changed the way my family dined the next weekend. And just really sharing the bits and parts with each other in a letter that they can read, that they can hang on to, and that their family can hang on to those things. Because you never quite know your loved ones like other people know them.
Yeah.
Do you have some more tips on stuff like that?
That's a beautiful, beautiful practice. And I love that. And I also love that that's something that could actually be read to the person even as they're dying, because hearing is the last sense to go. So often we think, oh, like, if they're unconscious, not responding, like, well, what's the point of saying anything? But the hearing is the last sense to go. So keep talking, keep sharing the stories, read the letters, do whatever it is. I think there's so much that can be done around to what a person loved to do in life. Like if they really loved being out in nature, like maybe they spend their last days, if they're immobile, like put them on the patio so they can be with the trees and whatever it is, or like put them in front of a window, or, take them for walks if that's still a possibility. If music was a big part of their life, there's a beautiful, beautiful organization called the Threshold Choir. They sing at the bedside of dying patients, but, are there singers in the family? Maybe those people can sing to them. Maybe there's special music that they like. Have that music playing. If they're still able to eat, what are the foods that really bring them joy and comfort? It's about sort of like surrounding them with what reminds them of their life, what feels honestly life-giving. Yes, they're dying, but I feel like part of what helps people hold on to their dignity as they're dying is to still see them as a human being. Like so often, and I know I've been guilty of doing this too, we refer to them as the dying person, the dying people, the dying. And it's like that immediately strips them of like, I'm still a human being. I'm still here and very much alive in this moment. If my body may be failing or shutting down, but I'm still a human being who's here. So what can honor that very real human presence?
Yeah. So, and I think what we're talking about here is this sort of before the loss makes the loss less of a high and low, right? Like,
yeah.
these sort of conscious parts of going through the process. Now, so then, and that is all if we're fortunate enough to be able to see what's coming.
Yeah.
But as you said earlier, there are these occasions when just out of the blue, we get a phone call and we've lost somebody really important, or our life, something that we counted on as a foundation of our life, some job, something, some opportunity, just gone. Talk to us about how we walk forward with those things rather than trying to move on from them.
Yeah. I mean, it's.
What are some practical tips? Do you have any good stories of people that you've seen do that well? Things that have worked well, even accidentally for people?
Yeah. I mean, the letter writing that you mentioned is actually a wonderful practice for staying connected to loved ones. I think whether it's traumatic or not, a very good practice is still sort of being conscientious about how do I want to carry this relationship forward? What would that mean for me? You know, I have had people who they make it a point to like spend time with their person, whether it's doing the things that they loved to do, going to the places that they love to go, cooking the foods that mattered to them or the recipes that, you know, brought them joy. One of the things that I have always really loved that some people do is if there was some, you know, charitable organization, nonprofit, something they were devoted to, they might start supporting that organization in their stead. Or if there's a quality that they really admired about this person, whether it was their generosity, their humor, their love for animals, something about them, they choose to then consciously embody that. You know, there are parts of our people that we get that we don't really consciously think about, but like, oh, how can I now carry this part of them forward into the world and share it with others? This part that meant so much to me. So it's always sort of keeping the person with us and knowing that we don't ever have to let go of that. It could be 20 years, 30 years, 40 years. If you want to still be sitting down and eating your dad's favorite lasagna recipe or like listening to the playlist that you made of all his favorite songs, like whatever these ways are to keep your person close to you, like, yeah, honor them. Absolutely.
And then there's a sense of belonging that can be found in folks that grieve together. I know that you run something or you're a part of. Talk to us about Hallowed Wilderness.
Yeah. So this Hallowed Wilderness is my life practice where I do the coaching.
Okay,
yeah. It's Salt Trails.
Salt Trail.
Yes. Yes. Yes.
Talk to us about that. I did some research on the internet about that, and it sounded really, really interesting because, you know, a sense of belonging is what gets us through most of the hard parts of life.
It's so true. So Salt Trails I didn't know that it would become Salt Trails. I had this idea it was the second year of the pandemic, and I just kept thinking about everyone grieving in isolation, feeling so lonely. And in this culture where we hadn't talked about, and we still don't really talk about grief, like what it must be like for so many people to be grieving and having no idea of how to have those conversations, how to reach out for support each other. And I just kept having this vision, and I called it a processional. It could be like a parade, but like this whole parade going through neighborhood, like a grief processional or parade, just with signs, people wearing whatever their grief looked like for them, just to sort of presence the fact that grief is here. We're all grieving. We're all carrying something. And I was like, this is kind of a weird idea. Where is it coming from? I don't know what to do with this. And ultimately, I ended up reaching out to some friends who I knew saying, hey, I have this idea. What do you think? Am I crazy? Can we make this happen? And they were all on board. So we got together to plan a grief processional But in the process of planning that, we also started creating other community events where people could come together and process their grief in community. And that led to the creation of Salt Trail. So our whole idea is community rituals to come together through, through art, through movement, beauty, however we create the container so that people can have a shared experience of processing their grief, and also to make grief public and visible, to say this is not something that deserves the stigma it is. It's a very natural human response to loss and change. And in this time when we have everything from eco grief to gun violence to our own personal loss, like everything that we're grieving, here's a space we can all come together and know that it's like, you're not going to be judged for expressing what you're feeling.
So I saw some great images from it. Give us a better picture of what you're talking about. It looked like it turned out to be like a group walk, like a whole bunch of people walking along. Everyone was dressed in something that they perceived as related to the grief.
Yeah.
Grieving climate problems. Some were grieving the loss of a loved one. So there was all kinds of grief.
Yes. Yeah.
What it looked like, and how long did it take? And tell us.
Yeah. So we've had 2 grief processionals now since we started. We've sort of made it our annual event. And what happens is we choose a very public space to do it, because part of the idea is sort of to disrupt this narrative around grief that it has to be hidden and shied away from. And we gather everybody, like you said, we always encourage people to wear your grief. And we say, whatever that looks like for you, if you want to carry a sign, if you want to wear, the t-shirt that belonged to your sister, if you want to dress up, like, one of the women in the collective had this whole whale costume she wore the first year, because to her, whales are like sort of grief allies to her. They help her in holding and feeling her grief, but also representing, the oceans and what we're doing to the oceans and the creatures who live in them. So people got very creative and showed up. The first year we walked through a neighborhood. This past October, we walked through a very, very busy park in the city, where there was a lot going on. There was a market happening. There was actually another parade that had happened that same day. And it was just so meaningful to walk through and have people sort of pause. And not everybody paused with curiosity or reverence or anything of the like, but so many people just did pause, like, oh, what is that? Oh, grief. And maybe the reaction is, yeah, I am carrying some grief too. So just a moment to invite that acknowledgement that, yes, it's okay that I am grieving, and here's a space for it. Some people, I would meet an eye in the crowd and they would just tear up briefly as we acknowledge each other. We also encourage people to join as they felt called to. Not many did, but just voluntary connection of like, oh, you see me in my grief. How beautiful. There was a woman with her child, and the child was like, oh, what kind of parade is that? And so that sparked a whole kind of different conversation about grief that they might never, ever have had. So we do the processional, and then we also include a ritual where people can really release something that they're carrying that's heavy and invite in something that they feel is going to nourish them or support them or just really, hold them in their grief.
And what else I love about that concept is that it reminds us of this. One of my very favorite sayings is, everyone is carrying a burden. It's just that some carry theirs better than others for now.
Absolutely. Yes.
And that is the thing. You see a parade come by and it's about grief, and you go, oh yeah, I'm not the only one who's lost this or that during this pandemic. Oh yeah, maybe I could do something outside of what I am doing that would help me walk forward with this. And that's another, then the whole parade idea is, I love the metaphor of walking.
Yeah. It's really been beautiful and sort of transformational, and honestly kind of took on a life of its own. Because here I thought, okay, we'll do this one thing and that will be it. But people are really hungry for this kind of community offering. Yeah.
Now, this was in Philadelphia?
Yeah.
And okay, so that brings us to a good topic. Connect us to some other things that you know are out there that are doing, because obviously if we don't live in Philly, we can't be there. But there's, and you've already, I think you mentioned the Grief Cafe.
The death cafes.
Death Cafe. Tell us about more ideas like that, because this getting stuck is a lot about what your work's about, is about, it's easy to get stuck in grief.
Yeah.
What are some other cool organizations or things that we can connect to that can get us unstuck that you've seen? Ingenious things like your salt trails.
Yeah. So I want to highlight Reimagine, that's a national nonprofit. And they, since the pandemic began, actually have had a huge grief outreach offering. I mean, most of what they do is virtual, but they have so many offerings from like poetry, music, lectures, vigils, so much to bring people together to honor their grief and work through their grief and let them know they're not alone. I believe you can find them if you search letsreimagine.org. But really a very, very wonderful organization. There are people, I think we just don't know, there are people in communities all across the US doing different kind of grief work, offering rituals, but you can also create your own ritual. I know there is something beautiful about coming together in community, but maybe whether you do it by yourself or you just gather a group of friends and you say, hey, I'd really like to have this circle tonight to talk about grief. Maybe one person brings a reading or a poem or some passage that's about grief to sort of open the space. Maybe you light a candle to also sort of initiate the fact that you're going into this. I think it's Oscar Wilde who has this quote that I've always loved, where there is sorrow, there is holy ground. So maybe you light the candle to sort of just activate, this landscape has now changed. We are on holy ground. And then you invite people to just share their stories. Or maybe you invite them to each bring an object. If it's about the grief of a loved one who's died, bring an object that belonged to them. Tell me the story of this. Tell me why it mattered to you. And then you can have songs after, you can share a meal after. It doesn't have to be that you seek something out that's outside of yourself or that's this formal thing. I just think we don't have this language and we don't sort of have this, we're not in touch with our own natural instinct that really can inform how we grieve. And it's something so many indigenous cultures around the world have and just do. But we are so removed from that in the individualistic Western world that these ideas don't come to us very naturally.
And something I've found a beautiful thing about being connected to so many people's lives through our practice. I think I've said my husband and I have both been dentists for 30 years.
Yeah.
Very relationship oriented practice. So we take the time to chat with people.
Yeah.
Part of the beauty of being able to do that, especially when we were going through hard times in our life, and it's a small town that we practiced in, so everybody knew it when we had the 1 pound baby, or when Chuck had his sister, his brother-in-law, and his mother die, and all of it. I tell you, people say the darndest helpful things. There are some that don't say helpful things, many. But I tell you, the way to get unstuck, in my experience, is to let people in and let them share their wisdom, their lived wisdom with you. And once in a while, you get a pearl that just, boom, it just gets you unstuck. And that's why I love the idea of the Death Cafe and this Reimagine and the walk and all these things, because it gets you out there. You got to show up in some place to have access to other people's wisdom.
Yeah. One of the things I'm going to be starting in the spring are grief walks. And I know this happens in other communities where let's just gather in a beautiful place. All of us are grieving something and we're going to walk. Yeah.
Lovely. I will share also with folks something that's really helped us through this past strange 6 months. We also build cairns. We have a yard with lots of stones. And I have us caring for my husband's best friend who died at age 56. I'm looking out right now at my kid's favorite babysitter. We built a cairn for her. We found a stone that was shaped exactly like a heart. And so there's a big cairn out there with the heart stone on top of it. Like these, and we have accidentally with our kids, because we're not involved in organized religion, we didn't have some way to actually process the loss of all these people. We built cairns.
I love that so much because I have studied an indigenous Andean tradition that also builds these cairns, but they call them apachetas. And so I build them too. And I love that idea of turning it into a grief ritual if you're so called. And it doesn't have to necessarily even be something elaborate where you're talking and there's different parts. It's very just an intentional building of this. Yeah. I love that you do that.
That the cairn that we built, we found out about the death of my husband's best buddy when we were traveling in Slovenia. And the moment we were traveling in Slovenia, we were near a stream and my husband just reached down and he grabbed a giant handful of rocks and he just put them in his backpack. And so the cairn for his buddy is made from all these little rocks. It's just a little cairn this big that sits on our patio. But it doesn't have to be something big. I built a cairn when I found out about the death of my husband's mother, where we were walking. We were at a basketball game in Connecticut, and right where we were, we just found a whole bunch of rocks. We built one little, and then we took a picture of it. We knew that we're never going to see it again. So it's not like we focus on the thing, but we have this beautiful picture of this crazy cairn that we built right there on the side of a busy road. And it's kind of beautiful. And it's in just the image of it reminds us of being able to smile. And we talked about the other person, about Chuck's mom while we were building it. Oh yeah. And do you remember that story? This sharing of our individual places that we found comfort in grief is a really, really important part of what you do too, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I love that. The cairns, in some ways, they're almost like an altar. And some people build altars where they have pictures of their loved ones and things that they love to eat or drink and just whatever reminded them of their loved one. But you can also build altars for like periods of transition, when you asked about if you're coming off of a divorce or you lost your job or something that was really hard, like maybe your altar has items that symbolize what would I like the next part of my life to look like? What do I really want to call into my life now that I've experienced this huge change? And do you sit there and maybe just sort of think about that? Whenever you feel sad or overwhelmed with emotion, do you journal? Journaling is like a huge, huge practice for so many grievers to get in touch with what they're feeling. And it's funny because I'm a writer, but I am not a journalist myself. So I am not. You give me a blank journal page to write about my feelings and I will just sit there staring at it. But what I love is giving people prompts. And they're often very, very simple prompts like, I forgive, I release, I love, I celebrate, I honor, and you don't have to think about it. The idea is to just start writing based on the prompt and let your hand go across the page. Usually I invite setting a timer for anywhere from 7 to 10 minutes and just write. Because it takes you out of your thinking brain to not lift your hand from the page. You're just writing whatever comes to you. And that's also a form of processing and release and gaining insight.
Yes. I think that we very often, at least what I'm noticing after interviewing so many great folks who have fresh ideas about this, that, or the other thing, just like the conversation we're having today, is that very often we just haven't put enough imagination towards the problem. That's what the problem is suffering from, a lack of imagination.
That word, I love that word so much, imagination. Yes.
Right? And then you talk a lot about in your work about us keeping the dignity in death so that we have designed what we think is dignified, so forth.
Yeah.
And of course, when things just go to hell, that's the most undignified way to process a loss, right?
Yeah.
So the more we have ahead of time that's beautiful and feels like graceful, you use, I think, that the word gentle
Yeah. Yeah.
A lot.
I do.
I love that. Okay. So, one of the things that we always like to wrap up with is, what do you really wish people knew? Like people ask me, what do I really wish people knew? And if I put on the spot and I get only one sentence out, I have this one thing that I really wish people knew. And how about you? What do you really wish people knew after seeing all that you've seen and all your lived experience around grief? What do you really wish people knew?
I really wish that people knew that you're going to be in a lifetime relationship with grief.
Mm-hmm.
I think that would take off some of the pressure to move on and get over it and like resist it as if we could somehow just make it disappear or fix ourselves or change something. That might be a hard thing for people to hear if they do just want to get over it. But there's something about acknowledging that it's a lifetime relationship that I think it's like, oh, it's a relationship. It's not this burden I have to carry. How do I want to negotiate this relationship? What does it mean to tend this relationship? What is this relationship asking of me? I think there's also sort of like a reverence, at least for me and a lot of people I work with, that comes, and a softening that comes with acknowledging that, so that they can really allow themselves to honor their grief in a way that feels good to them.
Oh, that's lovely. That's lovely. Because that is where all the friction in life happens, right? Is our resistance to the way things are.
Yeah. Yeah. And there's something too, I think, about working with grief that really we're touching into this incredibly tender parts of ourselves. And that really opens us up to love more of the world. It might feel like impossible, like I just lost the love of my life or that, but you're really, when you're practicing self-compassion, when you're letting yourself go into this like really deep, profound ache that you're carrying, it's such a big energy that it is going to, if you let it, open you up to being present to more of the sorrows of the world, which is like how we all learn to be better caretakers of each other, better stewards of this planet, how we learn to really be present to what this life is right in front of us.
Yeah. Yeah. It's this being present that's really the key in so many aspects of
right.
So
yes.
that we want to, that challenges that we want to solve, fix, and and find a way to work with it. Okay, so what has to happen next in your view of what's possible? You've opened us up to a new way of looking at loss, whether it's death of a loved one or our own passing or loss of a future we'd hoped for and things change. What has to happen next to help this ease, this kind of gentleness with this topic burst onto the scene, like get to the next level so we have more, like you said, death literacy or loss literacy?
Yeah.
What has to, grief literacy is the word that you use, which I love. I looked up the word literacy just to see, and it means knowledge, and the word literacy means knowledge, and I'm not, maybe the word expertise isn't there, but familiarity.
Yes. Yeah.
So you can say wine literacy. Oh, I have a lot. But now we can have grief literacy.
Yes. Yes. Which I love that word so much because I think it's so important. And, on a micro sort of individual level, I think what needs to happen next is we just start talking about our grief. So often people say it's just so hard to talk about. And I'm like, well, it's hard to talk about because we don't talk about it. But, you're calling somebody up to say, oh my gosh, you wouldn't believe what just happened to me today. Or you're talking about your first date or what your baby, that first milestone, all the things that we share that are such a part of our everyday lives. And yet grief is also there in our everyday lives. And we don't reach out to somebody and say like, today's a really hard day for me. I'm really missing this, or it was really hard when this happened. So I think one of the things is to just start talking about it. I would love for there to be grief education in schools. I think like what a life skill to introduce grief at a young age. And so often we think like we try to shield children from grief because we think it's too hard for them to, handle or think about. But since it's something we're all going to experience at some point, how beautiful if we could start talking about that in schools at an early age. This is what it looks like. This is what it feels like. Here are some coping tools. There's nothing wrong with you if you are grieving. It is perfectly and absolutely normal. I mean, think about how much shame and stigma that would let go of to just start doing that. Plus, we all need these skills.
Yes.
Yeah.
And what about grief counseling? There's a lot of focus in the corporate world on wellness and well-being. And we, of course, my kids went through this there in the working world. I have a daughter who's a engineer, and she lost an aunt and uncle and both grandmothers in the 6 months. And she could only attend one funeral because she has so little, I guess, sick time, personal time, what have you.
Yes.
Just worked for this company for a year. So she hadn't accrued a lot of sick time. And that was so heart-wrenching for her not to be able to go to these funerals with three of the four people that she loves so much. And I think there is a place in this world for a lot more corporate understanding in the workplace about grief. Do you agree?
I absolutely agree. I would love for there to be more grief support and grief education in the workplace, whether people have workshops, presentations, resources that are readily available. I often think too, when people are in grief, it's so hard to like step out of yourself and seek out support. And you come to work, your dad's been dead for 3 days because you have your 3 days bereavement leave. And it's like you're in a fog, you're hurting, all these things are happening to you. And it's like, oh, well, here's our employee assistance program. Like, find yourself a counselor. But, if there was somebody there that you could go to and talk to, or if there had been sort of ongoing education and literacy so that people know that what can they expect of you at this time? It's not like, hey, we're going to have this 60-hour work week and you're expected to do all these things. Or like, if I find you crying in the bathroom, like, oh my God, but what am I supposed to say in this moment? Just like creating a culture where it's okay to bring your grieving self to work. Not that you have to be falling apart at work or like, constantly like devastated, but that expectation that we're supposed to show up and perform as we always have when our world has been completely rocked and transformed. Like, it's just not realistic. And so I would love for there to be some additional support around that and some additional, knowledge. And like you said, with literacy, familiarity. Yeah.
Now this is gonna make me go out and find who's doing this sort of thing right where our little town is. And I'm going to have that in my hip pocket for my staff. We've got, at the dental practice, we have 12 employees, and we are going through every life's ups and downs with each other.
Yeah.
And I feel like as leaders, that's a wonderful thing that you can have, even if it's something just as informal as, here's this wonderful person in our town that I never knew existed, who might be just a great person to have a phone call with or a cup of coffee. Even if you just go that far for people, like I said, what I've noticed is that we build on each other's wisdom in most of the hardest spots in life.
Yeah. And you've shared, throughout this conversation about how like supportive you are of your patients. Like, I think that's so great just that you ask, how they're doing in these tough moments. Cause I also think about how many of us go to our doctor and it's like, they ask about our stress levels or they ask what we're eating or our sleep, but nobody ever said, well, have you experienced a recent loss lately? And that is such a contributing factor to our well-being. I mean, the CDC has this health-related study that they send out, and it's measuring all these different like mental health and physical health aspects, smoking, seatbelts, all these things. Solicits no information about bereavement, about the death you've experienced, how far are you removed from the death, like nothing. which just speaks to, the lack of awareness and literacy and the continued stigma.
Well, I tell you, we've gone a long way on taking the stigma off mental health. That whole conversation is really advanced in the last 2 or 3 years. So maybe we can get grief going in that direction.
That would be so amazing. A friend of mine and I actually just did a grief workshop at a mental health clinic. And that was a really beautiful opportunity to just sort of presence that, hey, grief lives here. Which is really it.
I just can't thank you enough for this lovely conversation. You've opened up worlds of things, and I hope I haven't talked too much myself this time, but when you are connected to thousands of people's lives, you have to develop some methods of your own to cope and move forward and be helpful to others and yourself. And I certainly have had a long professional life of opportunities to do that or pull the covers up over my head. Okay. Well, thank you so much. How can people get a hold of you? What's the best way to contact you if they want to dive deeper?
You can find me at my website, which is thishallowedwilderness.com. I'm also on Instagram and Facebook at This Hallowed Wilderness, LinkedIn, Naila Francis. You can email me, Naila at thishallowedwilderness.com.
Okay, great. And I want folks to know that we have really, really good show notes on this podcast every week. And you can find links to every single thing we've mentioned. And then if there are particular parts of this podcast that you really enjoyed, we'll have the timestamps for certain parts in the show notes at the Goodness Exchange. When you look at this podcast on the Goodness Exchange website, it's entirely different than seeing it on the other normal podcast outlets, just because we have the opportunity to write an entirely beautiful article around this episode. And so you can find lots more information there. So thank you, Naila Francis, for helping us see with a better, you're carrying a lantern on something that we all are going to go forward through. And I love the way you've helped us see it with more clarity.
Oh, thank you so much. It's been an honor and really a great joy to talk to you about grief, Dr. Linda. Thank you for your presence and your amazing questions. Yes.
Oh, thank you so much. Okay, so I hope all these connections to goodness and progress and wonder and possibility will carry you through your week, and you start finding all the joy and wonder that Naila and I have been talking about. Thanks.